Okay, everybody sitting in the back row gets called on first. I'm going to ask you about 2 weeks. I'm going to ask you about 2 weeks ago. You were just there. All right. Watching the parking lot out back, we've got people straggling in, but we'll go ahead and get started. David, you got a check? We all good? Okay. David and I were talking this morning and both realized that we actually still have 2 more weeks to go because this is August and we have a little bit of a funny calendar. So I had been trying to figure out how I was going to wrap all this up next week and realized I have another week. Which is actually, it's good. It means I need to take a couple of things and kind of format them a little bit differently. The last couple of weeks, we've really set more background context around 1 Corinthians 13, around kind of the term love, what we mean by that, what the context is. And we're going to kind of keep working through that maybe a little bit differently this morning and break it down a little bit more. But one of the things that we can do, and kind of looking at some of the material that's out there, is clearly the term. I mean, we use one word for love, and as we said before, we use that to kind of mean everything from I love jalapenos to I love the world to, or the environment to I don't love Jeff, but I sort of do. Depends on how the last meeting went that we were in. But, we kind of have this whole range of things, including our spouse and family and so forth. So there's all these different contexts. We went through the 4 kind of traditional Greek words for love, but they're actually about 6 or 7 depending on how you really count it. And then there's all these nuances between there, some of which are clear, some of which are not. And so we've kind of got this sense of what we go through in 1 Corinthians 13, which we frequently use in wedding ceremonies, and yet that's a different context of love when you really kind of think about it and work through that, even though it's a great kind of base for that. But it's not a well understood context. And then there's a lot of flow between. We've talked about agape and phileo, brotherly love. And if you look at even Jesus' interaction when he's asking Peter 3 times, do you love me? He's actually changing which word he's using as he goes back and forth in that discussion based on how Peter's responding to him. So we can tie it to, Peter denied him 3 times. We can, you can tie it to kind of through all that, but it's also clearly there's some nuance going back and forth on how those 2 words are used kind of interchangeably as Jesus is having that dialogue with Peter. So there's a lot of context around that, but ultimately we can make it so complicated, or we can elevate the idea of agape kind of so high that literally it almost becomes a feeling that we can't get there. It's hopeless or it's unreachable. It's actually more kind of God's love for us, and therefore it's something you might aspire to, but you can't actually do or reach, which I don't think is what was intended, and certainly I don't think that's what Paul's intending when he writes 1 Corinthians 13. So you can actually, I think, make it a little bit more approachable in terms of when you actually kind of go through and look at some of the characterizations. The most important thing is just this notion that it's not just a feeling or just emotionalism, but it's really about something that transcends kind of temporary emotionalism. So we touched on a little bit, but we like to kind of put more really positive, soft, kind of emotional context or words around love. But how much do we also put the idea of tolerance or indulgence or even forbearance within our context understanding of love as well, and yet those are all part of it. And particularly, as we went back into the Beatitudes, that idea of kind of agape love and phileo weaves all the way through the Sermon on the Mount. As we kind of went through that last week. The interesting thing is we focused on, because we're in the New Testament, we're in Greek, and kind of the Greek words. There's one word that's used in the Old Testament. It's called Hesed. And Hesed is interesting because it's actually translated out of Hebrew into loving kindness, not as two words, but as one word. So it's literally like a compound word, loving kindness, and that's kind of the best translation that you can get. So if you look at Jeremiah 9:24, it says, I am the Lord who exercises loving kindness, okay, as a single word. But what he ties to that is loving kindness, justice, and righteousness on the earth. And so that's a consistent kind of use of the term for God's love in the Old Testament is just that one word, Hesed. The other thing we've talked about a little bit is we are commanded to love, right? So directly from Jesus, we've kind of read several of those passages. We're actually commanded to agape, but also sort of to phileo. And then, beyond the 1 Corinthians passage, of course, we have the fruit of the Spirit. What leads off of the fruit of the Spirit? And we'll come back to that. But that idea of this kind of deep, abiding love is a core of what we are to become or what we are to work to as Christians, and how we are to both deal with, one, our relationship with God and loving God, two, our relationship with each other within the body. So all of the one another passages, love one another, how we treat each other is clearly a major discussion with Paul, but not just with Paul. It's also in John. It's also with Peter. So the way we treat each other, because to a certain extent we're kind of coming out of an environment where they're writing to new non-Jewish Christians, or to Jewish Christians who, in particular, other than writing back to the Christians in Jerusalem, they're in a pagan environment, and they're being basically encouraged to move away from the worldview of that pagan culture and pagan environment, and it's all about me. So that's kind of where they're coming from, is moving from it's all about me to leave that view behind and start with it's all about God, and then it's all about one another, and then it's all about my neighbors or others, rather than me. Okay, so there's a lot of other things that get attached around that in terms of inappropriate behavior that they're supposed to leave behind, kind of what they see going on in the world around them. And they are, in a sense, called out while still being part of the world. They're not with the world. And love is kind of the consistent theme that rolls through all that in terms of how our relationship with God, maintaining that real connection, because it's not just about behavior. It's kind of go back to James, and it's faith, grace, but it's also works. And so it's leaving things behind and taking on a new set of behavior, but also with a different heart that has to grow and develop over time. So that's the idea when particularly Paul's writing here and says the greatest of these is love, faith, hope, and love. And when you start to get in and go back up into 1 Corinthians 13, which we're gonna do a little bit, and think about kind of that whole context. This is a way to break that down a little bit. Take all the rest of the wording away, and just say on the top part of this chart, how does Paul characterize love in 1 Corinthians 13? So these are the words, and you can go back and forth a little bit between which translation and which words get used. But you could do an entire study just taking each element of 1 Corinthians 13 and each word that's used and just walking through that and say, well, what does that really mean? And then the bottom is other words that get either used kind of biblically in the context, or they're going to come up quickly as synonyms or antonyms of love. You could use a bunch more. I mean, there are other things that you could pull out that you could use to, say, characterize love, and, what are we really talking about? What do we mean? What do you think demonstrates that someone is actually exercising or practicing a loving attitude or loving behavior? And if you think about that, you could kind of come up with your own list. But if you just start with even that top part of the words that are used in 1 Corinthians, the two that are in parentheses are more kind of a little bit of a translational difference depending on, so no record of wrongs, that connects pretty much to forgiving. In other words, rather than holding a grudge, rather than continuing to dwell on what somebody else, did to me that was wrong, and I'm going to actually swirl around that, continue to fester on that, etc. It's that, it could also be translated as an attitude of forgiveness and forgiving. So the interesting thing when you start going through that list is some of those are a little bit easier to connect with. Patient. Don't ask my wife about that. Okay? So one of the things you can do is take this list, and you could ask your spouse, but, decide which context you're going to put in. Is Carol going to ask Barry how she's doing on each of these relative to their relationship, or relative to all the relationships here, or in maybe a broader context? But this is one of those where there's a book that we used to use a lot in consulting called The Reflective Practitioner. And the idea is that when you get to the end of a project or after some kind of large event, you step back and you think back through kind of the interactions and what happened and how you approached it. And you don't do it to wallow in kind of all the stuff I could have done better, or what mistakes, or I can't believe that person said this to me, or, et cetera. Instead, you're going through it and saying, what can I learn? And what can I do better? And what things did I fall short in, or where I need to, do some development work on that? And so it's that, kind of sense of stepping back and saying, constantly learning. And one of the ways we learn is feedback, right? I mean, you can do this yourself. I mean, we literally had, kind of a process we were supposed to go through, and you could do it yourself, but sometimes you do it with a small group, et cetera, in terms of doing a project review. So it's not the fill out the form project review, it's the what did we learn kind of orientation. And that's kind of what you can do out of this as well. So if you basically either have what I would call an encouraging, discipling friend or partner, as opposed to a discouraging one, is to, walk through this list and say, think about it. Don't get caught, again, when you read 1 Corinthians 13 and all the other words. Just literally kind of take the words out and say, okay, some of this, I probably do okay on. And some of this, maybe I don't. We just got through the Olympics. And do we all understand the Olympic judging scheme for gymnastics, or even better, synchronized swimming? I don't have a clue. I can kind of get most of the gymnastic stuff, but synchronized swimming is just like a mystery. So this is sort of, your approach to ultimately Jesus or God are going to be kind of your Olympic judging system for, how well agape is going to characterize you. But if you start to work your way through this, I can probably pick on kind or kindness or a variation on that and say, I probably do okay. I don't particularly get jealous. I would debate with people on whether I can be arrogant or not. I don't think so, but other people do. So, they're going to be somewhere. You're going to have to argue through those. I work pretty hard at not being rude, but there are times. Not easily angered? Well, it depends on the context, right? Am I driving the car and did somebody cut me off? And how do I feel about that? Is it something my kids did? Is it, whatever your spouse does that, you've got that button right on the center of your forehead that they can push anytime they want to, and it sets off an automatic trigger, all right, and gets a response. Why do they still push it? Well, that's all on them. But, you can kind of work your way through these. But if you take it and then you say, okay, how patient am I with people at church that maybe I don't agree with or have a little bit different perspective on things or like doing things a little bit differently? I think mostly, the fact that you guys are here this morning, the way we've worked through COVID, I'd say as a fellowship, we've done a pretty good job of persevering through some hard things and sticking with it. But has everybody done that? In the current world environment that we're in, which is not just, we kind of tend to get focused on our own backyard, but it's pretty tough. And there's been a lot of things that have gone on over the last year and a half that I think have, think of a better way to put it than trimmed out people that didn't have a deep faith. So go back to the parable of the sower, and you'd say, there's been some interesting changes and dynamics as we work through this, because that sense of being willing to persevere through things based on and relying on love to carry you through when things get difficult. What about does not delight in wrong? Just follow the news this week or any of the social media you really shouldn't be reading. And you're going to see a lot of people really happy that somebody else had something bad happen to them because they deserved it, because politically we didn't agree with them or their position or their direction. And there is a ton of that going on right now. It dominates a lot of what we see out there. How does that fit within the notion of agape love? Kind of not there, is it? It's the exact opposite. It's like love does not delight in wrong, as in evil happening or bad things happening to somebody else, even if, they're a very unlikable and unlovable person. That is a really tough one today to get through, because that's not where our society comes from. That's not where our culture is coming from. Rejoices in the truth. Well, I'd say that's been a problem with us for the last couple of years on every front. Okay, where we've struggled with, what does that really even mean? Trust. How many of you think you're trustworthy? I mean, really. All right, I hope all of us are, but I will tell you that dealing with family, hey, I trust my kids, I trust my wife. I'm not so sure about some of my sibs, or her sibs, or, So when you kind of get outside of that, and the interesting thing is, when you see a word like that in the middle of this, and you said, love trust. Does that mean blind trust? Does that mean I actually know that you are untrustworthy and I'm going to trust you anyway? Or is it about how I respond understanding that context and saying, I'm going to constantly give you the benefit of the doubt, even though I know you're going to disappoint me, but I'm going to do it again anyway. Well, I don't like that. That doesn't really feel too good. So let me kind of bring it even a little closer. Is I can tell you as an elder that can be a real struggle, because there are people that you need to rely on to do things that you actually know you can't trust them to follow through. So how does that affect what you do? And I mean, there can be lots of good reasons. Overworked, overcommitted, busy family life, all those things. And that's all true. But when you're trying to get something done, do you trust that person to get it done or not? Well, okay, that's one part of the discussion. The real idea of where Paul's going and working through 1 Corinthians 13 is, do you still respond to that person in love or with respect or with concern and consideration for them, even when they're not living up to your expectations? Right? That's a lot tougher when you start to work through this. So this could be, I would say, if you want to do it, it's an interesting exercise. Might be better if it wasn't your spouse, again, just for a lot of reasons, but somebody else and then put it in a context. So think about, I could say for all the elders, we could, kind of do this ourselves in terms of going through and saying, how am I doing on this? How are we doing, in fact, as a group is a fair question to ask. Of kind of our role and the kind of love that we're actually showing for the congregation, for people in it. Have we actually done everything over the last year and a half that we should have or could have as elders? And I can tell you we've had that discussion. The answer is clearly no. But it's a struggle, and that's the whole point. It's constantly kind of an ongoing struggle, to work through that. And continue to push, because if you look through that entire list, you just don't get all that day one. And that there's a very different sense of that being how we talk about love, based on a love of God, God's love for us, our love of God, and then beginning to work through that and reflect that out to everyone else around us. The people that we are in fellowship with, that we're part of Christian community, and how we treat each other within that. And we read last week, we read a couple of times. How are they supposed to know? How is the outside world supposed to know we're Christians? By the way we treat each other. Okay, they'll know us by our love. So it's each other, but it's also others. So look at the bottom list, and you get a little bit different, kind of some added context through that. And you get a few things that have a little bit more emotional, context. Altruism. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. What is altruism? What passage do we read? It's really tough, this, We're sitting in the auditorium, we're kind of spread out here, then we got online, and you can ask a question, you're asking yourself, so everything has to be kind of set up that way at this point. The notion of altruism, of course, is doing something purely for the benefit of someone else, not for you, and truly expecting nothing in return, right? Which we would use to characterize kind of brotherly or agape love. And it's where a lot of us get in trouble with, try giving somebody a gift and then not getting a thank you back. Does that bother you? Okay? If it does, then you probably have a problem with some things on this list. Because the nature of giving, and with agape as the motivator, or with an altruistic attitude, is I don't even think about it. I give it and I move on. Right? I'm not expecting a whole lot of thanks or special consideration or, that's called a bribe, but that's different. That's Chicago politics. So, there's some real debate about altruism, which I'll come back to. Then there's the notion of benevolence, which is really tricky because do we all believe in being benevolent and benevolence? Yes. But is benevolence the core of what we would characterize by kind of the context above that? Well, you can be benevolent and actually not truly be loving, or not be loving in that kind of biblical agape sense. Generosity, right? Again, that can be, it's a part of it, but it can also be something where the rich young ruler, okay? I'm giving, but that still kind of isn't all of where he was or where his heart was. Grace, we clearly think is kind of part of that equation. It's up in the forgiveness, forgiving ourselves as well as others. One of the hard things about love your neighbor as yourself is what happens when you're dealing with somebody who doesn't love themselves, or really struggles with lack of self-worth or sense of value, etc. If they truly treated everyone else the way they thought they should be treated, that would not be a good thing. So everything has a nuance to it when you walk through this. Warmth. Okay, we just said before that love isn't an emotion, and there are times when actually love is really hard, right? If we are enabling our kids or a family member or anyone else, that's not real love. That's kind of a temporary, transient. It's less heartburn for me if I just give them what they're asking for, as opposed to this is what we have to do because of where we need them to be, or where we hope they'll be, or where we're praying they will be 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road, as opposed to enabling bad behavior. So there are, again, we talked about earlier, there are really hard aspects to love as well. Did God do a lot of holding his people accountable in some really tough ways? Okay, we just went through with Arrow Bible Camp a whole story where there's a bunch of that woven in, and things that come kind of back out of that. So there's that warmth there, but there's also not limited to just, do this right now because it feels good, or it's less of an issue, or it's kind of to that indulgence. A little bit of indulgence as in tolerance, as in let it go, is okay, but not in fact if as you look at it, it's not helping somebody to grow. Okay, which is then where we get offline in terms of speaking the truth in love. We all heard that phrase growing up. How many times have we actually violated the entire spirit of that by telling somebody something in a really ugly way, but I'm doing it in love? Do you not tell them the truth? Or is it about how? And how we deal with people? How do we deal with people who's in the world whose behavior we don't agree with, or we wouldn't condone from a Christian, biblical, scriptural perspective? Do we still deal with them in love? And I don't even have to go into we could spend a lot of time in detail on that and what falls into that. Okay? It's not about condoning behavior, but it's about how we deal with them as we're dealing with that behavior. Or, the level of kind of respect. Mercy's a good one, but you can show mercy without being loving. Judges do that all the time. Okay? So it's what's the attitude, and a lot of what's below that is kind of what's the attitude that comes with it. How does it fit within kind of the broader context? Tender-hearted. Do you hurt for other people? When they go through struggles. Even if you can't do anything about it, is there a response? that's generated by your concern for them, by your love for them, by wanting them to work through even a difficult struggle or something they're going through, where even as you're making maybe hard decisions, okay, it's hurting you. I mean, one of the things that Paul actually didn't include that list is love hurts, right? We all know that one. There's a bunch of songs that talk about love hurts. Usually that's talking about sort of the emotional, eros love, et cetera. But really, it's very much, do we hurt God? God loves us. Do we hurt God? Does his love for us hurt him? The answer is yes, right? I mean, we can read most of the Old Testament and know that that's part of how we would characterize that. So this will kind of be out there, but you could make the list up yourself pretty quickly. I'd forgotten to get these to Jennifer so she could have them posted. But think about getting somebody that you could walk through this with. And again, it's not intended to be a negative exercise. It's like going through the fruits of the Spirit. Years ago, I did a little grid with the scoring mechanisms, et cetera, for the fruit of the Spirit. And, it was kind of a walkthrough just to think about where are you. So I want to hit that next. And so this is if you think about it, what's the thing that when you step back, and we're going to go to Peter in a minute too, but when you start with the fruit of the Spirit, the first fruit is love. Okay? So what the Spirit is, and love is also characterized as basically the Spirit poured out love. We get love through the Spirit. That's where we turn to help us through this process. We turn to the Spirit. We turn to the indwelling of the Spirit, but it's love, joy, peace, forbearance, okay, patience, being willing to keep working through it, forgiving others, the concept behind that, kindness, okay, we got that one in there, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness. Yeah, we kind of didn't really see that on the list above, but, that's part of the mix in terms of firm but gentle. And then, the interesting one to end with, which is self-control. Why is self-control there, and why is self-control in 2 Peter as well? Because if you purely emotionally respond to things, that's anger with sin, right? I mean, we're told it's okay to be angry, but don't sin in your anger. Okay? We can emotionally respond in the moment and do things that we really shouldn't do. Even, quote, in love, you can do that. And you can do something that if you step back and thought about it, there's probably either a better response or something that's better for them long term. That's how a lot of indulgence and enabling happens. It's also how we kind of weave all the pieces together and continue to grow, is through self-control. Now we, as a body, have at times sort of misused both passages out of 1 Corinthians 11, and this, and said, oh, well, self-control means don't show any emotion at all in services, or, hugging's okay, but, you got to be careful about that too as well. And that's not what self-control is intended to imply at all. Emotional responses, look at Israel celebrating. Look at David, okay, in celebration of God's deliverance or something God has done, and dancing and, being joyful. But it means not responding, not reacting, it's bringing kind of the pieces together and acting in love over time. So, we live by the Spirit, let's keep in step with the Spirit, not become conceited, provoking, or envying each other. And all that is literally talking about what we do kind of within the fellowship, if you will, within the community, that then is reflected outside of that. When we kind of move back into 2 Peter again, and this is where, if you take the kind of individual words in 1 Corinthians 13, and then you start to kind of tie them back to Sermon on the Mount last week, and then you come back again into the fruit of the Spirit, and then, back into 2 Peter again. And you take that list of words and realize you're better at some things than others, that are aspects or dimensions of love and how we deal with each other. You don't get there overnight. It doesn't, when the Holy Spirit is kind of working with us and through us, it's not instantaneous. It's basically a lifelong journey. It's about transformation over time. So we go back to, we started with faith. We believe, we make that commitment, but then we got to build from there. Goodness, we're going to change the way we think about and deal with other people and start to work on that up front. We're going to add more knowledge. We're going to grow more in terms of context, understanding what it means to actually kind of have that relationship with God, and then what that means to how we deal with others. And then to knowledge, we're going to add what? Self-control. We're going to start kind of building that in. And for a lot of people, that actually is the sticking point. That's the hardest one. If you have anybody who says they have a short fuse, okay, that's what having a short fuse is, lack of self-control. As a psychologist, worked through this many times, but you don't lose your temper. You make a decision to lose your temper. You allow yourself to lose your temper. There's a very small percentage of people that actually have a medical, physiological, chemical kind of trigger that actually causes emotional instability, if you will, in that context. And it would be fair to say they lost their temper, but sorry, most of us don't get to use that excuse. Okay? It's unfortunately our problem. Okay? And that's, the unfortunate reality. From that, we add perseverance. We continue to plow forward. We don't give up. We have hope. You go back, re-listen to Jeff's, okay? We have hope. We persevere. We continue to look forward. We continue to believe in other people. Okay? We continue to go back to people who disappoint us, and we go back again and again because of being driven by love or things that we need to do for them in terms of their well-being, or, again, it's, we continue to be there for people even when we really don't want to be. So it's more than just, we keep going in general. It's also we keep dealing with people around us that disappoint us. We keep treating them with respect. We keep encouraging them, or we keep and maintain kind of a positive attitude, relationship, etc., regardless of what they do. That is right where things get tough. Okay, go back to Jesus' comments on how we treat our enemies, and we pray for them. Perseverance, we add godliness, brotherly kindness, and then finally, we keep working towards that broader sense of love, and we do all that partly because we're trying to live godly lives in a pagan society. And who are we? We are foreigners and exiles. So when you get caught up in things that have a different identity perspective around it, are you losing track of this? Okay? That we are basically, first and foremost, children of God. We are Christians. That's where our identity comes from. We're part of a broader community, not to say we don't do things and we don't take care of people in our backyard, but we also, this is not our home. And that's a tough place to land and actually live and work that way and not get caught up in all the other things that are going on around us and all the noise. And then finally, we're going to kind of come back next week and pick up on this. But I would say, again, I'll make sure that's posted. Go back and take the table and spend a little bit of time walking your way through it. The power of love, when we really kind of put that full context around it, through God. And that's part of what we're going to come back to. Most of you have heard me talk about humanism, universalism, what I would call generic spiritualism before in other classes. They're not the same thing as being a Christian, as the power of love or working through God. I don't know if that just turned off. Are we timed out? Because we're after time. So we're a couple minutes over. Oops. So we're going to get into a little bit of what that means for that love to be through God. For the kind of, again, the flow we've talked about, the love of God, the love of one another, and then the love of others. Any of you familiar with the term sociobiology? Nobody? Okay. Humanism? Again, we've talked about it. Humanism is the notion of take all this and say, how does this play out? When in fact your standard of care, if you will, of love is based on human standards and instead of God's. It's based on flexible truth or even, quote, science. And what does that really mean? One of the main books in sociobiology, when it was all getting started, was kind of the term the selfish gene. So that should give you a clue, which is the idea that there is no such thing as altruism. It's really all about you doing things to propagate your own genetic gene pool. And it all comes back to that as the core versus anything higher or beyond that. So when you accept that as your standard, and that is the core of what's behind kind of the current definition of humanism. So it's all about you as the ultimate standard or decider as opposed to God. And where does that leave you? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that next week. And we're only a couple minutes over.